From the looks of some of their approaches, some pilots think flying an ILS approach is a lot like a good sword fight. The glide slope and localizer needles are crossed every which way. Well, dueling needles are not what you want on an ILS approach. There are really only two keys to flying a perfect ILS approach. The first key, plan ahead. You do that by self-briefing the approach and setting up your radios while you're still some distance from the airport before you get busy. The second key will have all your fellow pilots asking you for pointers, and you already know it too. Make small corrections sooner instead of big corrections later. Tracking the ILS well starts with intercepting the localizer well. Since the localizer course is quite narrow, making the needle very sensitive, it can take a long time for you to recover from the gyrations caused by a bad interception. When a controller vectors you to the localizer course, he'll normally try to give you about a 20 to 30 degree intercept angle that has you join the localizer about 3 to 5 miles before the final approach fix. The intercept could be from either side, either from this direction or from this direction. The idea is for you to have time to pin down the localizer needle before you intercept the glide slope. But sometimes your intercept angle will be greater than that. If you do a procedure turn, you'll have a 45 degree intercept angle. And on some approaches, a transition might give you as much as a 90 degree intercept angle. One important way to make the localizer interception go well is to know where you are and when you're about to reach the localizer. A big help is to have both the ADF and GPS set on the locator outer marker. That's what we did when we set up the radios for this ILS approach to Jacksonville. The ADF needle gives you continuous information on the position of the NDB in relation to the nose of your Skyhawk as it marches down the dial toward the final approach bearing. And using the NAV4 map page on your GPS shows you your relationship to both Ellis and the airport. As you get close to the localizer, the controller might give you a clearance like this.
Cessna 9er Echo Sierra, 5 miles from Ellis, turn left heading 080, maintain 2,100 until established, cleared for the Jacksonville ILS runway 5 approach.
When the controller clears you for the approach, you should have a clear picture of just where you are and just what you're going to do from there on in. As soon as the localizer needle comes off the peg, turn toward your final approach course. In this case, it's 052 degrees. You're looking for the reference heading that stops the needle movement. When the CDI stops moving, stop turning and track the localizer using that stopper heading. If the localizer needle isn't quite centered, make a small correction towards the needle to center it and then return to your stopper heading. And if you haven't done so already, this is a great time to slow to your final approach speed and lower 10 degrees of flaps. As you get close to the final approach fix, think of the 5 T's. That stands for time, turn, throttle, tune, and talk. We'll start with time. You'll start your timer at Ellis in case you have to do a localizer-only approach. You will cross Ellis just a few seconds after you intercept the glide slope. You won't have to turn since you're already on the localizer and your course continues straight into the airport. But you will throttle back when you pitch down as the glide slope needle centers and you begin your descent. You've already tuned in the localizer frequency, so you're ready to talk whenever approach hands you off to the next frequency. And that's likely to happen just before you reach the outer marker. By the way, if approach has not handed you off by the time you cross the outer marker, that's a good time to ask them about it. Controllers have been known, on very rare occasion, to forget to give a pilot a handoff to the next frequency. Now, as you fly inbound on the localizer at 2,100 feet, you'll be below the glide slope, so the needle will be showing a fly up indication. Continue at 2,100 feet, and as the glide slope needle moves down from the top of the dial, lead it just a little bit before it reaches center by pitching down and making a throttle reduction to start your descent. You already understand the concept of the reference or stopper heading for tracking the localizer. Well, you use the same concept when you're tracking the glide slope, except now you're looking for the reference rate of descent. That's the rate of descent that will stop the glide slope needle from moving and keep it centered in the indicator. So how do you know what that stopper rate of descent is? To get your required rate of descent on the glide slope, a good rule of thumb is to multiply your ground speed by 5. So, if you're flying a typical ILS approach at 90 knots in your Skyhawk, you'd need a rate of descent of 90 times 5, or about 450 feet per minute. The reason you use your ground speed is that the required rate of descent is higher if you have a tailwind and lower if you have a headwind. You can read your ground speed from the GPS. That's another way the GPS comes in handy. Or use your indicated airspeed plus or minus the reported wind as a very rough approximation. If precision is your goal, but multiplication your weakness, you could flip to the inside back cover of your NOS approach chart book. There, you'll see that to fly the glide slope at Jacksonville, which is the typical 3 degrees, at a ground speed of 90 knots, you need a rate of descent of 478 feet per minute. Good luck nailing down that extra 28 feet per minute. JEP shows the required descent rate down here in the same block that gives the time to missed approach. For some reason, JEP figures you'll need an extra 9 feet per minute. Now, just like when you fly the localizer, after you establish a reference rate of descent that stops the needle movement, make small adjustments to the rate as needed to center the glide slope needle, and then return to the reference rate of descent. And if the reference rate no longer holds the needle in the center, then pick a new reference rate of descent. That's most likely to happen if the wind changes during your descent, which is actually a pretty common occurrence. Now, as you cross Ellis Locator outer marker, start the timer. At the same time, cross-check your altimeter against the centered glide slope needle. The approach plate says you should see 2,080 feet on your altimeter dial as you cross the marker. Which brings us to that second key. Just as you've done when you're tracking the localizer, use small corrections sooner for tracking the glide slope instead of big corrections later. And make rate of descent changes of less than 100 feet per minute. For example, say that you've decided that 450 feet per minute seems to be a good reference rate of descent. So if your glide slope needle shows a fly up indication, you're below the glide slope. You'll need to pitch up for a little smaller rate of descent. You might try 400 feet per minute. And hold that until the needle recenters. When the needle is back in the center, reset your pitch attitude for the reference 450 feet per minute. However, if your needle shows a fly down indication, then you'll need to pitch down for a greater rate of descent. Try 500 feet per minute, again holding it until the needle is in its proper place. And if your reference rate of descent doesn't stop the glide slope needle, then find the one that does. That's your new reference. When you're tracking a glide slope, changes in your rate of descent tend to change your airspeed. So how do you change your rate of descent without changing your airspeed? Well, it's a piece of cake, really. If you pitch down slightly to increase your rate of descent, at the same time reduce your power slightly to maintain 90 knots. A good rule of thumb is to reduce the power about 100 RPM for each 100 feet per minute change that you want in your descent rate. And the reverse is true for pitching up. If you lose track of your rate of descent and get close to, but not quite full needle deflection below the glide slope, you'll need a larger correction. You don't want to stay low. But on the other hand, you won't need to go to a full climb. If you do, you'll probably go through the glide slope. So pitch up and reduce your rate of descent enough to see a positive needle movement toward the center, and increase your power as necessary to maintain your airspeed until you intercept the glide slope again. If you get a pegged needle on the glide slope, or for that matter on the localizer, go ahead and execute an immediate missed approach procedure. Once a needle is pegged, you have no idea exactly where you are, and that's not a good thing when you're in the clouds and close to the ground. Once you're riding the localizer and glide slope rails into the airport, your #1 priority is to make sure you don't descend below decision height until you meet the requirements to go lower. You'll normally reach the middle marker about the same time you get to decision height. The middle marker is one last wake-up call to remind you to check your altitude. But as you know, the middle marker is not your missed approach point. Decision height is. It's a good idea to call out how many feet above the decision height you are, starting from 500 feet above decision height and calling out every 100 feet until you get there. At Jacksonville, your decision height is 290 feet MSL, so you'd start your altitude callouts at around 800 feet MSL. At the altitude that you expect to break out of the clouds based on the weather report, start adding a quick glance out the front to your scan pattern. If you have a passenger or other pilot with you, ask them to help you by looking for the approach lights. When you do break out of the murk, you may be surprised at the sight picture. If you have a wind correction angle, it will appear that you're not lined up with the approach lights and the runway is off to the side. This can be very confusing. It's not uncommon for pilots to get disoriented during the transition to VFR. There are some things that can help you out, though. The light bar on the approach light system is a reference for wings level, and a visual glide path indicator is a reference for your glide slope. But if you get disoriented or lose visual contact with the runway environment after you've gone below your decision height, immediately start the missed approach procedure. So as you can see, those two keys to a successful approach, planning ahead and making small corrections sooner instead of big corrections later, those two keys will have you flying ILS approaches to perfection in no time at all.